very much. Well, it's wonderful to be here in Dallas. It's a wonderful city. You've got a beautiful skyline, wonderful museums and galleries, including the Women's Museum. Everyone's very friendly with that terrific and unique Texas charm. And if that's not enough, you're home to Neiman Marcus. You guys are so lucky. You know, you get the feeling when you're in show business that you live behind a one-way mirror where everybody kind of gets to look through it at you, but you never get to look back. So for me, the fun part of these days is that I get to come out and hear what you have to say, because I already know what I'm going to say. So I really look forward to the Q&A time when I hear from you. And it's funny, being a comedian's daughter, everything reminds me of a joke, and that does remind me of a story about a young woman who found herself seated next to Albert Einstein at a dinner. And after a while, she turned to Professor Einstein and she said, "Well, what do you do?" And Professor Einstein said, I study physics." And she said, "Oh, really? I finished that 3 years ago." Well, unlike that young woman, you and I know that we're never done learning. And one of the things I've learned also about being in the public eye is that it has its not-so-good moments, too. You know, someone in the supermarket will pick up a tabloid and they will feel for 100% sure that my husband and I are getting a divorce. On the opposite page is a story about a woman who gave birth to a whale, but nobody pays any attention to that story. My story, they believe. Once I went to Cleveland to do a play, and one of the tabloids had this big headline that said, "Marlo leaves Phil and moves to Cleveland." So I called the editor of the paper and I said, "Let me just get something straight, okay? If I ever do leave Phil, he's the one that's going to move to Cleveland." But I want you to know that Phil and I have been married now next month for 25 years. Thank you. We deserve your applause. You know, well, let's face it, marriage is hard. Its joys are more than worth it, but there's a lot to learn. But it's can be a very happy and comforting place. And this comes from someone who had some pretty radical views on the topic. Wasn't it Groucho Marx who said, "Marriage is a wonderful institution, but who wants to live in an institution?" I think my opinions on the subject of marriage were formed a little bit by Groucho and a little bit by Bella Abzug. You know, when I got married, Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem gave me a shower. And it was hilarious, I mean. And they hung all over the room sayings of mine that I had said in all the interviews through the years. You know, I never wanted to be married, so I said some pretty wild things. And I was really kind of flabbergasted to see what they were. And they were hanging around the room. One of them said, "Marriage is like living with a jailer you have to please." Another one was, "Marriage is like a vacuum cleaner. You stick it to your ear and it sucks out all your energy and ambition." So thank God Phil wasn't at the shower. But it's how I felt, you know, I mean, for many years. I mean, it turns out that it's not the case. I have a husband who supports my career and my interests, and I support his. I give, he gives. You know, I'll let you in on a little secret. Phil Donahue is the greatest husband in the history of the Western world. And he's nothing to brag about. When I was around 7 years old, I used to love to go to the studio with my father. He would take me when I had school off or summers. And one summer, he was doing a movie with Margaret O'Brien. And we'd go to the commissary for lunch. And imagine being 7 years old and sitting next to somebody that's dressed like a pirate, you know, or a cowboy. I mean, it was so exciting. And the movie that he was doing with Margaret, when I would go with him in the car, I would cue him on his lines. And we'd rehearse it in the car. And he would say to me, "Oh, honey, you do that every bit as well as Margaret does." Well, of course. I mean, my goodness, my heart just pitter-patted. And then we'd get to the studio, and I'd watch my father and Margaret O'Brien rehearse the lines that we had practiced in the car. And I remember watching her and thinking that maybe she'd just fall over in a dead faint. And then I could go on for her. I mean, I think to myself, well, why not? I already knew her lines, you know. But I finally got my chance when I was around 17, and I was cast in the play Gigi at the Laguna Playhouse, which is a terrific little summer stock playhouse that Betty Davis founded, and it was a real thrill. It was my first big part. But I was shocked to find out that all of the reviewers and all the interviewers were comparing me to my father. I mean, I knew, of course, I was Danny Thomas's daughter. I mean, I knew that they would refer to him. I didn't know that they would compare me to him. I was 17 years old, you know, and they were saying things like, well, it's left to be said as to whether or not she'll be as good as her father, or will she be as funny as her father? Will she last as long? I mean, hey, you know, hello, I'm 17. It was very, very difficult for me. It was very scary, and it really wasn't fair. I mean, I always thought and believed that we're all born with this white piece of paper, and we all get to write our own story on it. And here I was with a piece of paper with my father's name written all over it. I felt really deprived. And I went to my father, and I said, Daddy, I never thought I'd say this. I love you, but I don't want to be a Thomas anymore. I'd like to change my name and just run as far away as I can from all of this. And I waited a few seconds, which seemed like an hour, terrified with just knowing I was going to cry any minute that I'd hurt him. And he said to me, I raised you to be a thoroughbred. And thoroughbreds run their own races. They don't look at any of the other horses. They just wear their blinders and they run. And that's what you have to do. Don't look at me or anybody else. You just run your own race. And a few nights later at the theater, this big white box arrived. And inside of it was a pair of old horse blinders and a little note. And the note said, run your own race, baby. My first role models were my grandmothers. My father's mother, she was extremely witty and smart and told terrific stories in the Lebanese tradition, long. And she was married, and she and her one daughter would serve her husband and their 9 sons in the dining room. And then she and her one daughter would demurely depart and eat in the kitchen by themselves. And, of course, to me, that was a standard of womanhood. It's what I saw. But I also had another grandmother, my Italian grandmother, my mother's mother. She played the drums in a beer garden in Pasadena. And on weekdays, she billed herself as Danny Thomas's mother-in-law. And on the weekend, to get the younger crowd, she called herself Marlo Thomas's grandmother. I mean, she was an entrepreneur, my grandmother, you know. She knew how to do it. And as you can imagine, an awful lot of people wished that she would do something else. My mother wished that she would just retire to babysitting and making pasta. And my father wished that she was Bob Hope's mother-in-law. But for me, she was my role model.